Hello! Welcome to our book study launch meeting. I wanted to start off by introducing myself. My name is Carrie Knight and I'm going to be working with you through this book study. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, I began my education career working with 3- and 4-year-olds who had developmental delays. I did that for several years and then I moved into a mainstream classroom working in an elementary setting where a large population of our students were English language learners. In addition to working in elementary classrooms with English language learners, I also have been an RTI coordinator and a reading specialist. And most recently, I've spent lots of time working with English learners in a role as an English learner teacher and specialist. This topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart, as we are always looking for ways to support our English learners and to help them reach academic success. If you are joining us in person, you are going to be able to log on to joinpd.com, and you're going to be able to enter the code on the screen to tell us about your current role in education. What is your job right now in education, and what is your purpose for joining us in this book study? If you could join pd.com using our code, then you can go ahead and enter your answers for those questions. If you are joining us as a video recording and you are not in our face-to-face session, then you can actually see the link in the Schoology resources, so you can view the other people who were in the room during the face-to-face session, find out about their current roles in education and their purposes for joining this book study. During our book study, we are going to promote conversations among educators, among the colleagues in the room, that will help us lead to the application of the new ideas that we learn. This book study is also going to help us to focus on issues that are related to school change and those that can help improve learning outcomes for students. Our text is called Special Education Considerations for English Language Learners, Delivering a Continuum of Services. And this is actually the second edition that they have released. One of the greatest things about this text is it seeks to expose the myths and the inaccurate assumptions that are behind the referral process for English learners. It also helps to represent the integration of best practices from the fields of second language acquisition and also special education. It features team activities, checklists, and lots of tools, but also true story chronicles for collaborative discussion, which helps us to apply the concepts to our own schools. The ideas presented in these sessions are based on the author's work and information found within the text. There are 4 authors to this text, and you can see information about them right here. We have psychologists and language education consultants. We also have consultants and teachers that have been in the bilingual ESL education field for 30 or more years. We also have researchers and specialists who work with students with special needs, as well as specialists in the field of working across content with literacy and working in the field of RTI, response to intervention. Just to give you a little bit of background about how our book study will work, today is our first kickoff, our face-to-face meeting. But following tonight's session, we are going to have 7 online sessions. These sessions are going to start next week, and they will be self-paced, which means anytime during the weeks that you see, you can log on. You can view the Schoology resources, you can listen to the screencasts and check out any of the additional attachments and links and resources that are posted in the Schoology. So you'll work through that in addition to reading the text for the week, the chapter for the week, and you will submit to a discussion board at some point during that week. So your commitment during the online sessions would just be to use the Schoology resources, to follow the links, and to also read your text and respond to a discussion board. So that'll take place over the next 7 weeks, and then our final face-to-face meeting will be on Tuesday, March 12th from 5 to 8 right here. And during that time, we will kind of tie it all up, kind of put all the pieces together, and hopefully come away with some really good solid foundations about this particular subject. So as I mentioned a little bit ago, the self-paced weekly sessions will feature the 7 integral factors. So each week we're going to be looking at one integral factor, which represents one chapter of the text. You'll view the materials and the resources, and you'll respond to your colleagues on the discussion board. So as we move throughout the text tonight, I just wanted to make sure that we all shared a common language and we were aware of some of the terms that we are going to see within the text. When we come across the letters EL, we are referring to English learner. In the state of Delaware, we call an English learner an EL student. But within this text, the authors refer to English learners as English language learners, ELL. Essentially, they mean the same thing, but when we're using the words of the authors, we will use the words that they have presented in the text, which would be ELL. You might also see SWD, which stands for a student with disability. And in the text, they refer to LD as a learning disability. They do clarify, though, that when speaking about a learning disability, the author is using that term to describe the variety of cognitive, perceptual, language, or mathematical disabilities that would lead to difficulties learning in an academic setting. So they use LD, learning disability, to represent a wide array of disabilities that a student would have in a classroom academic setting. You might also see SWD/EL, and that would be a student with a disability who is also an English learner, and sometimes that's referred to as a dually identified student. One last thing that comes up quite often in this text is the word behaviors. Now, when we talk about the word behaviors within this text, we're not talking about the typical good or bad behavior. We are talking about the observable behaviors, which refer to what we witness as our students are doing something in response to specific instruction or intervention. So it's referring to the way a student acts in response to those things, not good or bad behavior. So just keep that in mind as we move through, because that will be a quite a large focus in many of the chapters, observable behaviors. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start by looking at some information that comes in the preface and the foreword of this text. Sometimes those are the pieces that we tend to not read when we begin a new piece of text. But within this preface and foreword, we get a lot of information about the author's thinking in creating this framework, the framework that we consider when we're talking about the special needs of English language learners. So the authors started with what they call the big question. Educators everywhere always ask them, how can we tell if our English language learner has a special education need? So the authors originally focused their workshops exclusively on this question. How do we distinguish between normal second language difficulties and long-term disabilities? But after a while, they realized they were asking the wrong question. Instead of thinking about L2 versus LD, the question was too murky and it just wasn't the right question to ask. So the authors started thinking about how could we fix this question to represent something that can bring about change for our English learners. So their foundational principle became that the work is about supporting a more effective and seamless continuum that's integrated into students' everyday school life, rather than trying to determine whether it's an academic challenge faced by an English learner stemming from second language development or whether it's from a long-term disability. Our focus more should be on the support and the continuum that we build into the everyday life of our students. So they decided to change focus. They moved away from the needing to know right away if an English learner has a special education need, and instead focusing on providing support that uses the benefits of both fields, the special education field and the second language acquisition field. And their goal became to ensure a continuum of services to make sure that students were getting the right support. So their framework became this continuum, the continuum of services, and it became the utmost importance to their work. So the framework seeks to help educators identify the specific challenges that English learners face, to help educators understand those challenges, and to help schools identify the interventions that would likely alleviate these academic challenges. The approach that the authors come up with will not work without several things. A strong collaborative model. Professionals with different expertise coming together to solve a problem. They call these ECOS teams, and we'll learn a little bit more about them later. But the ECOS teams coordinate information gathering, the formulation of interventions, and the support of teachers. So our goal for today's meeting is going to be to think about the key concepts of the framework and to identify those as we look through the text, to deepen our understanding of the reasons for misidentification, and to address some of the common myths about English language learners and special education. And finally, we'll review the steps in the continuum of services. So as we begin Chapter 1, we start to talk about this framework, the framework for helping to consider special needs of English language learners. The key concept of this is that to serve the needs of English language learners who are experiencing significant challenges in school, we must set up a system of support, a system to provide support in a continuum without interruption, in a way that's integrated into the learner's schooling experience. And we have to make sure that we're putting these in place immediately following the identification of those challenges. So the system is set up to provide support in an integrated way immediately after we figure out what those challenges are. The challenge that we face is that when English learners who are developing proficiency in a new language and who are learning academic content through a non-proficient language, when they're perceived as having an inordinate amount of difficulty in school, it presents a tremendous challenge for teachers and special education specialists and administrators. So we've got students who are learning a new language and students who are learning content in a new language, and then we have this perceived difficulty. They're not making the progress that we think they should be making, or they're not doing something that we think they should be doing. And when that happens, when difficulty is greater than would be expected, educators tend to jump to the conclusion that a student has a special education need. This tendency has led to two significant factors: over-identification of our English language learners as special education students, and also a disproportionate representation. So special education sometimes is viewed as a source of support. It's used as a way to get help for students who are experiencing significant challenges in schools. Educators choose special education as a source of support because they believe it generates help for English learners. It also provides funding. It helps to soften our feelings of guilt. We feel like we're doing something. If we qualify them for special education, they're going to get the support that they need and the help that they need. And so we start to feel a little bit better about what we're providing. And it really satisfies our need for accountability. So even though we know these are not appropriate, it does make us think that we are helping our students. Most special educators who serve monolingual students are not trained in diversity education or second language acquisition or bilingual education. And unfortunately, even though they're making their best attempts, those are often misdirected and they may not be what's most effective for our English learners. By placing inappropriate special education labels on English learners, it results in changed expectations. Also, convenient excuses for the English learner's observed or perceived difficulties. And it also gives us a belief that students' needs are being met, which leads to us providing less language-rich supports that are needed by a student who is still developing English proficiency. So those perceived solutions end up being negative. They provide negative results. So this guide has many different approaches to assessment and to service delivery that will help prevent misidentification. But before we talk about the solutions, we must present the 3 reasons why misidentification is most likely to occur with this population. Inside of your packet, you will find activity number 1, and inside of that packet, you will find 3 texts related to the reasons for misidentification that are seen here. So based on your birth month, it will help you decide which piece of text you are going to be reading about tonight: assessment, influence of the medical model, or funding biases. Your job is going to be to find your topic based on your birth month and to read the assigned text. You can use the template that's inside of your packet to note down some key ideas. And then when you're ready, please be prepared to share through joinpd.com. For those of you that are not joining us in a live face-to-face session, you can actually go on Schoology and see some of the information that your peers have typed up about the specific reasons for misidentification. In the next few slides, you're actually going to see the information that is presented from the text. But if you want to see what your peers came up with, you can actually look on Schoology in the resources. So problem number 1 for misidentification is assessment. And assessment is the most significant reason for the over-identification of English learners. Assessment of proficiency and academic achievement is difficult on its own. And academic and language challenges can manifest similar in English learners and students with long-term disabilities and special needs. So the behaviors and the challenges present the same way, but sometimes there's more complex variables operating, and we don't know the causes of these manifestations. Language and learning disabilities are often due to intrinsic factors, such as neurological impairment or problems with processing. But second language acquisition learners have challenges, such as the language learning process itself or cultural relevance. So sometimes observable behaviors may look the same between English learners and students who have special education needs. In this particular chart, we look at vocabulary usage. So we have 2 learners. First is an English learner who forgets a common word that has been taught. And then we have a special education student who also forgets a common word that has been taught. When we look in the middle column, we see that a visual aid might have been presented trying to showcase a concept, and it might have been culturally irrelevant. So the visual aid provided no support in helping the learner to learn the new word. So in this case, a student really needs help developing further proficiency in the academic language. Whereas with a special education student, that student may have oral language comprehension or production difficulties, or may have memory problems. And this particular student might need more supports to help overcome that learning difficulty. Often the data that we gather in our universal screening and referral and evaluation process are inadequate and inappropriate data. So they rely too heavily on norm-referenced and standardized test scores, which provide a very narrow, inaccurate view of what a student is able to do. Those things also focus on superficial aspects of the language structure, and their focus is to identify student weakness. It does not give us a good picture of what students are able to do, what students can do. And it often leads to confusion on what is being asked, or students who are unfamiliar with the cultural context that's being presented in the assessment. These tests are designed and developed for monolingual students. And other variables are not considered when looking at scoring criteria, such as contextual, affective, or developmental factors. In addition to this, we talk about the discrepancy model. So the discrepancy model for identifying students with learning disabilities does not serve English learners well. First of all, ELs have lower scores on verbal tasks in English than on tasks that require less verbal processing. And the discrepancy model describes characteristics of normally developing English learners. IDEA gave permission to go beyond the discrepancy model and embrace an idea of providing interventions to help improve the learning environment, and then to monitor how students responded to those interventions. That was called RTI, the response to intervention, and we will actually cover that a little bit more later. So the problem with collecting reliable data is that in order to find out what an English learner can do and cannot do, we have to gather a considerable amount of data, and educators lack the time and resource to do this. We also have to make sure we're collecting qualitative data that are meaningful and useful. Often the data that we gather, it's being gathered and being interpreted by those who are not versed in EL education issues, or second language acquisition, or cross-cultural education, or any implications of those factors. And often the English learner specialists are not even involved in collecting the data or helping to interpret it. So sometimes language proficiency testing is completely overlooked in this process. Our second problem, and our reason for misidentification, is called the influence of the medical model. So as we try to understand special needs that some students have in schools, a lot of us look to the medical model with the notion that disabilities and challenges can be identified like a list of ailments that are recognized in diseases. It's been falsely suggested to educators that special education needs can be easily identified in a reliable and valid manner. And often the whole complexity of the phenomenon and the individuality of the English learner are overlooked. Also, the criteria is informed by ideologies that are in vogue or accepted as the current norm, and they are complicated by ambiguity and subjectivity. So the authors have quoted here a clear demonstration of the problem: the extreme over-identification of English language learners as being learning disabled and language disordered when no such over-representation exists in categories that can be medically validated, things like visual or hearing impairment. This is a clear demonstration of the problem. We're not over-identifying in areas that can be medically validated. This leads us to problem number 3 for misidentification, and it's funding biases. IDEA provided legal support for special education, and it helped to create a funding category within the educational system. But before schools can receive that supplementary assistance for their students, they have to be formally identified as a student with a special education need. So identification of these disabilities is connected with additional funding, and that funding gives schools much needed resources. So it's tempting to place students in special education when they fall outside of what we call normal, regardless of the underlying reasons. And sometimes that can have the opposite effect, with under-identification for fear of monitoring or litigation. So we have to make sure that we are providing relevant services in a timely manner, and the accurate identification of English learners is so important, especially in these 2 ways. First of all, the label carries an added stigma for English learners. Our mainstream society already perceives English learners as having a lower status, and they don't value languages and cultures that English learners bring. Our immigrants and our refugees are marginalized, and they often do not participate in the larger society. So having an added burden of a stigmatizing label that's not needed is not helpful. In addition, the learning environment may be affected. So we have to make sure that we're providing the most effective learning environment for our English learners. And best supports come from expanding the proficiency in language development, not necessarily in special education interventions. And while waiting on referrals, sometimes English learners do not get the specialized supports and interventions that they need. Now we are going to listen to a story from an English learner parent. Our Chronicle 1.1 is about a student named Monica. If you are not listening in our face-to-face session and you are actually on the Schoology, you can find the PowerPoint video upload, Chronicle 1.1, and listen about Monica. Now we are going to listen again, and as you listen the second time, I want you to think about the following questions. What beliefs did this parent have that are supported by research? What misconceptions does the parent have, if any? What did the school do that was effective? And what did the school do wrong? Now what I'd like you to do is just turn and talk to someone who is nearby, either to your left or to your right or in front or behind. Find someone that you can chat with and have a quick conversation about some of these questions. Then I'm going to ask you to go back onto joinpd.com using our code, and on the slide that has these questions, you can actually respond to these on Pear Deck. If you are joining us and you are not in the live face-to-face session, you can actually see some of our colleagues' responses on the Schoology resources. So as we come back, we are talking about the influence of myths in the area of special education and English learners, and how they misguide us. They misguide the way that we approach education, the way we interpret student behaviors, and the way we teach and assess our learners. So now we are actually going to begin some group work. We're going to give you a chance to get up and move around and to work with some of the colleagues in the room. We are going to do what's called a read, pair, share, square, write, share. That was a mouthful. Your job is going to be to read and think about one of the myths regarding special education and English learners. And then you're going to find your pair. You're going to find one other person who has the same number as you, and that number is indicated on your packet of information. Then you're going to share in your partnership about the myth and the author's response. As you square up, we'll find another partnership with the same number as you, and we'll square up to discuss those further. And then we're going to find the chart with your number, and we're going to summarize the key parts of the author's response. Your job's going to be to write reflections about the myth and or the response that the authors present in the text. And then we're going to share our group discussions back with the whole group. If you are not face-to-face live with us tonight, you can actually check out activity number 2 in Schoology, and you can read about the myths regarding English learners and special education and see some of the follow-up questions about the text. You can also look at the information that has been presented from your colleagues that are here in the face-to-face session. As you read, some of the main points that we want to think about is, what is the author saying about this myth? What are their main points? And what are your thoughts and feelings on this myth and or the author's response to it? Have you heard about this before? And if so, by whom and in what situation? Where and why do you think this myth has originated or become so widespread? And if this is something that you hear again or something similar, would you be able to use the information provided in the text to help you address the speaker? And if so, what would your approach be? What would you say or what would you do? So our group time is going to work out to be about 25 minutes. We're going to do our reading and our thinking for about 5 minutes. We'll give you a chance to read over your myth. Then we're going to pair up rather quickly, and then we're going to begin our sharing process. You're going to work with a person who has the same number, the same myth as you, and you're going to work towards sharing together. And then after 5 minutes, we're going to square up, find another partnership with the same number, and we're going to write our responses, and then we'll have time for sharing at the end with the whole group. Behind the text on the 3 myths, you'll also find a template that you could write some notes on. We're going to call this Debunking the Myth. Think about the author's main points and about your thoughts and feelings, and some of those questions that we asked you to consider. So as we begin to move forward and we talk about establishing a continuum of services, two major changes have to occur in our school culture. First of all, we have to stop the urge to formally and quickly categorize a student in a special education placement. And we have to use the monitoring of student progress to help guide teachers. Looking at that first change, disposing the urge to formally and quickly identify a student into a special education placement, the way that we are going to do this is we're going to gather information as extensively as possible. We're also going to introduce instruction and interventions that we believe will be the most effective for the observable behaviors into students' everyday routines. We're going to try to circumvent the compulsion to provide only interventions that are allowed by specific funding sources and instead provide meaning-based instruction. And we're going to make sure that those supports are introduced as soon as challenges are identified. For change number 2, we're going to begin to use monitoring of student progress to help guide teachers. We're going to decide which interventions to maintain, which ones to change or omit, and we're going to take the response to these interventions to be used for decision making. Effective interventions may end up becoming part of a student's IEP if the team decides that a full referral is needed. But along the way, we're going to make sure that our response to the interventions are used for decision making and that we're really watching the way that we use our interventions, making sure that we keep what's working, change what's not, and doing what's right for kids, right for our English learners. We have to make sure that we are doing a culturally and linguistically responsive approach, right? It has to be well implemented. It has to be a proactive approach that doesn't wait for students to fail, but instead provides enhanced instruction in a timely manner across all grade levels. We have to place an emphasis on high quality, consistent, and effective instruction that is linked to assessment. And we have to focus on students in a very explicit way. Collaboration among disciplines and a creation of roles for problem-solving members is going to be key in this framework. So in order to establish a framework, we're going to look at 3 pieces, and these 3 pieces are going to become the basis of our work tonight. So when we start by talking about the framework, we talk about a collaborative model for information gathering. Then we talk about describing before diagnosing and providing that continuum of services. So what we're going to do now is we're going to investigate the key ideas behind those 3 pieces of the framework. And your job is going to be to decide which one you think you'd most likely learn about tonight. Which one you want to dive into a little bit more deeply tonight. So our group work is going to be to help us investigate the collaborative model, the describing before diagnosing, and the delivering of a continuum of services. This takes place in our chapters 2, 3, and 4. The collaborative model is to think about how to provide a continuum of services. In order to do this, a team of staff with expertise in many different areas must collaborate to gather information about the challenges that students are encountering, as well as characteristics about their home life and school life. The team would then suggest interventions and monitor student progress. So in this particular chapter, you're going to learn about establishing an ECOS team, what the roles and responsibility of that ECOS team are, about gathering information, and about building capacity and how to become a catalyst for change in your school setting. So if that collaborative model is something that you're interested in, then you may choose to dive more deeply into chapter 2 tonight. Our second category is describing before diagnosing. The first step in providing this continuum of services is to gather information about the specific and observable challenges that our students exhibit by describing those behaviors as specifically as possible. So in this chapter, you're going to learn about the importance of describing before diagnosing. looking at the what rather than the why, thinking about the process of data collection and the explanation, and then reframing the issue. How do we describe it, explain it, and support it? Our chapter 4, Delivering a Continuum of Services. This has to do with when an individual is not doing what we think they should be. They're making less than expected progress, or they're showing specific difficulties. What effective, meaning-based interventions can we provide that draw first from the field of bilingualism and multilingualism and teaching English as a second language? So we do that first, and then if needed, from the special education side. Right? And putting in place things that are going to change the individual specific level, but also a general school-wide systemic level. In this chapter, you'll find out about providing support in a timely manner, a little bit more about response to intervention, or RTI. You'll find out about solution-seeking approaches based on meaning and challenges to the continuum of the services framework. You'll find out about crafting and evaluating interventions, about validating difficulties and intervening across contexts, and how home language and culture can be used as resources. So if that's something that you're interested in, then you would be diving more deeply into Chapter 4. So in this case, we're going to let you choose your own topic, the topic that kind of resonates with you as you listen to some of those key concepts from those 3 areas. If you're interested in working on the collaborative model of information gathering, we're going to be working on the left side. If you are thinking about describing before diagnosing, you'll be on the right side of the room. And if you're interested in delivering a continuum of services, you will be on the back side. As we begin investigating the framework, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to choose your topic based on those 3 topics that we heard about, and you're going to move to the correct part of the room based on the chart on the previous slide. Once you get into your groups, you are going to be reading the chapter and discussing the chapter with colleagues. We are going to provide a note-taking template for each of those chapters. Basically, that lists out lots of the ideas that are found within the text, and throughout there are blanks within the note format for you to fill in key words that should really resonate with you from these particular chapters. That'll kind of save you from having to take too many notes, but it'll also give you a chance to really dive in and to kind of pick out some of those most important parts from the chapter. As you're doing that, I also want you to think about some of the key questions to ponder, and those will be on the next slide, so we'll show you those. And finally, you're going to prepare some kind of a chart showcasing your group's thinking. When we come back together as a full group, how can you and your group members present your ideas to the rest of the group that kind of sum up the chapter and the idea that you're working on? Some of the questions to ponder as you think about the framework is, how does this framework compare to the process that you already have in place in your school? Is it similar? Is it different? How? Also, what changes would you need to make in order to come closer to what this framework is suggesting? What possible challenges do you think you might face as you attempt to make these changes? And how do you think those challenges could be surmounted? At this time, we are going to have group share-outs from the 3 different chapters that we have been investigating. If you are not joining us live face-to-face, then you can actually see some of the information that was compiled by your colleagues on the Schoology website. Finally, as we wrap up our night, we're going to talk about our next steps and moving forward, what's going to happen after our face-to-face session is finished for the evening. Over the next 7 weeks, we are going to be investigating the 7 integral factors that must be considered when we help to explain the challenges that our English learners are overcoming. The first is the learning environment, personal and family factors, physical and psychological factors, previous schooling factors, oral language and literacy development, academic achievement, and cross-cultural factors. You'll join us in our weekly online sessions by reading the chapter, viewing the resources, and responding to the discussion board to interact with your colleagues. On Schoology, you'll find that the materials are posted at the start of each week, and you'll work at your own pace throughout the week to read, review, and respond. Our final face-to-face session will be on March 12th, held from 5 to 8 in this room, and at that point we will work on putting it all together. We'll talk about how to create enriched environments for our English learners and kind of sum up the learning that we have done over the previous weeks. Before we end tonight, I did want to just give a big thank you to you for dedicating your time and energy to help improving the outcomes for our English learners. Thank you very much, and we will see you online.